Good evening, everybody. I'm not going to stand up there. I get nosebleeds. My name's Lou Strugala. I'm a pastor of Church by the Bay over in Galloway, and I serve as a chaplain for various police departments, New Jersey State Police, the Atlantic County Sheriff, and actually Summers Point. I've been asked to come here and talk about suicide. I'm no expert. That's why we have Matt. That's why we have Mike Parmenter. They're the experts on it. I'm here because we're all in pain. I didn't think I hit the button. I want to share with you for a minute one of the reasons that I'm so proactive or try to be proactive in it. I have two good friends, Pat and Carl. Their son was in the Special Forces as a medic, served in Afghanistan, came home and had severe PTSD. Pete was a strapping man. I mean, guy could have won a bodybuilding contest. But it terrified him when he heard the rain on the metal roof of their house because it reminded him of the war zones. I spoke to Pat, his mother, the day before Pete killed himself. And I said, please send him down, send him down. Let's get together, let's do something, let's make something happen that will help him. And it was too late. There are three things I want to talk about when we speak of suicide. Number one, I don't ever want to say it in a way that makes it any softer than what it is. Somebody we love has killed himself, and they're no longer here. And I asked your pastor if I could be direct, and he said yes. So if I say stuff that hits you in the gut, I apologize, but it's a better way than trying to smooth it over or put a frosting on it. Two, I grew up in a Catholic faith, and for years and years it was always that God condemns somebody for suicide. And that is absolute garbage. I don't believe it scripturally, I don't believe it morally, I don't believe it in my spirit. Because the one thing that all life has, whether it's human, whether it's animal, we all have the desire to survive. Think about that for a second. All of us want to survive. And if we lose that desire to survive, we can't be held responsible for our actions. There's a mental disconnect that's just occurred. And so trying to point the blame on somebody, trying to take guilt for the circumstances is a very painful and I think unnecessary thing to do. We need to realize that maybe this was God's peace. And I know that hurts when I say it out loud. But maybe it was the only way this individual could get peace. Finally, the one thing that I've learned about suicide, because I've had the unfortunate circumstance to bury way too many victims over the last few years, partially because of drug overdoses, partially because of depression, partially because of COVID, is that our actions must be immediate. We cannot wait till tomorrow. So if somebody is hurting, if you can't take the time to do it, get somebody who can. There's plenty of resources out there. Matt and Mike Parmenter will both talk about it. There's so many ways that we can save one another. And I look at it very much as Christians, we save one another. Jesus gave us the message, but we have accountability to one another to live a Christian life. We have accountability to one another to live a healthy life. And sometimes that's a very difficult thing to do with all the environmental issues that we deal with, all the cultural issues. So tonight, is a time for us to learn. It's a time for us to heal. What's going to happen is Matt's going to come up and talk for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for some questions. Mike's going to come up and talk for about 20 minutes, and we're going to open it up for some questions. And my hope is that this is the beginning and not the culmination of a program like this. I had another young lady who's a PhD candidate at Montclair State who was supposed to be here tonight, but she's stuck on the Parkway and she's not going to make it. She's what I call a suicide survivor. She attempted it. She was a cutter. And her suicide scenario came because of her abuse at the hands of clergy in the church. And I think she has a story to tell all of us, because sometimes when we trust people, they may be the cause of our depression or our stress. And Crystal has done remarkable. As I said, she's a PhD candidate. By God's grace, she's taken her life and really done a turnaround. I also look at suicide as a survivor, because there was a point that I was so despondent that I can tell you what the stainless steel of a .38 Special tastes like. And I can tell you what a hollow point bullet looks like from the wrong end. Somehow, some way, I didn't pull the trigger because I wanted to see the sun for the last time. And when I walked outside, God just stopped me. And I put the gun away. But when we do resiliency training for police officers, I tend to bring that out because I've kept it all these years. Not to use, I haven't fired it since then, but just a reminder of how far down we can get, but God can bring us forward. So I'm going to introduce Matt to come up and do his thing, and then open it up to some questions.
Thank you, Lou. I lived in Colorado for 5 years, so I can handle the elevation. All right. I'm just going to open in a word of prayer. Father God, we come to you tonight with this very difficult topic, Lord God, and Father, we just come before you with open hearts and minds, Lord, that we may learn something that may offer hope. Father, we thank you for just the way that you provide hope, and that you are the author of salvation, Lord God, and we thank you for it. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So as many of you know, my name is Matt Jacobs. Lou was asking me how do I know this church? So I've been here a while. So my wife Angie and I have been coming here since 2005. In 2017, I began work. Actually, was hired in 2016 with the Department of Veterans Affairs. So tonight, I'm going to share a little bit about some of the work that I've done in the area of suicide prevention. I don't know that I consider myself an expert on this topic. As difficult as it is to say it and as hard as it is to hear it, I feel like the experts on suicide are no longer with us. And oftentimes, when I think about this topic, it can be very difficult because it is such a complex issue, and it is very difficult to grapple with. Some of you may remember an age, 60, 70 years ago in past generations, where if you had cancer, you weren't allowed to talk about it, right? It was one of those words that we just didn't say, and that seems foreign to us now because it's become part of our culture to accept and to understand and to really embrace folks who are struggling with that illness. However, I think as I think about that in relation to suicide, I think the same holds true for mental health issues and for suicide in general in today's age. It's not something that we really want to talk about. It's not really something that we want to be confronted with, and it sure is not something that we ever want to have to deal with in our own lives. In working with the veteran population, I think one of the difficulties when guys are going through difficult times and having thoughts of suicide is that generally everything isn't always going well in their lives. Now, maybe externally on the outside looking in, things might be looking good. There may be some looking from the outside looking in, you might say, oh, well, this person looks like they're doing great. But in the internal struggles and the internal battles that manifest themselves in forms of sometimes substance abuse, alcohol abuse, broken relationships, difficulties, lashing out, anger, resentments, all sorts of different things that can come out of it. One of the things that I realize is that a lot of the vets that I've talked to will say things like, I'm just tired of being, a pain to my spouse. I don't want to exhaust the people in my life, right? They don't want to have to be a burden, right? So sometimes people just feel so burdensome, and that can be such an anchor in their lives that they're just sort of carrying on their shoulders. And to help people to put that anchor down for a second and recognize that they're not burdening others, but it would be more of a burden to not deal with that. In other words, to continue to carry that alone is not only a burden to you when you're going through that, but it's also a burden to others. So how do we figure out how to kind of lighten that load a little bit, right? So I do want to also just say, just briefly in terms of housekeeping, if this is a heavy topic, it's tough. If you're here tonight, maybe you've been impacted by this, maybe in a very powerful way. If you need to step out, into the lobby, feel free to do that. That's okay. This is a very difficult topic to deal with, and one that if you have to step away for a minute, there's no shame in that. There's also some really good treats out there too, so you can always grab a brownie while you're out there. As it relates to this topic, I'm going to share a few bits of information. I could say a lot about it, but I'm going to kind of narrow my focus just a little bit. There's a few things that I wanted to bring up. If you were here on Sunday last week, you may have heard me say that suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in our country and has been for over 100 years. Suicide takes more lives of policemen than crime. Suicide takes more firemen than fire. Suicide takes more soldiers than the battlefield over the last 10 years. So this is a very difficult issue and one that we're going to talk a little bit about tonight. A couple of key facts as you talk about suicide. One of the things that we talk about is means, right? The way that somebody is thinking about taking their life, right? I had a guy tell me one time that he was going to starve himself. I said, good, I can work with that, man. You're going to be here for a while. I can definitely work with that one. I'm not too scared of that. But when we work with the veteran population, they tend to be a culture that's more likely, I should say, to have firearms. And firearms actually claim the lives of about 70% of veterans. So we know that if somebody uses a firearm, they are more likely to complete suicide with deadly outcomes. Whereas for the general population, it's more like half. So just putting that out there. And again, some of the things I'm going to talk about relate to veterans, but they can be applied to anybody in our society. One of the things that was really shocking to me, and I still have a hard time sometimes wrapping my brain around this. In 24% of suicides, and there's a ton of research put into this, and this is something that this has been studied for decades. From the time of decision to action, for about 24% of people who take their lives, they estimate that time from the decision to take my life to the act of taking my life is less than 5 minutes. So just think about that for a second. So somebody decides to take their life, somebody takes their life in a span of about 5 minutes. So he wasn't kidding when he said, you got to act quickly. For 48%, you think, oh, well, that just must be a couple people. For 48%, that time is less than 20 minutes. So they say for about a half of people who die by suicide, the time that it goes from thinking about it or deciding to take my life to actually following through on it is about 20 minutes. And 70%, it's within an hour. Now, there certainly are some folks who plan things out way in advance, but for a large majority, we talk about creating time and space, right? When I work with guys and gals who have identified suicidal ideations, in other words, they're thinking a lot about taking their life, we roll our sleeves up and work on a safety plan. And because the reason why we want to talk about a plan is because we know, like, look, if you have these thoughts, what's your plan, right? We can't just put you in a hospital for the rest of your life. We can't just put you in an armed room for the rest of your life. You have to be able to live your life and to be able to grow and to get better. So we roll our sleeves up and we get to work on a safety plan, and we identify what are the triggers, what are the things that you can do on your own, who are the people that you can call, who are the professionals in your life that you can reach out to, what is the national crisis line numbers that you can reach out to, and 911, right? So those are some of the things that we kind of do talk about in terms of progression. So hopefully some of this is helpful for you guys tonight. I want to talk a little bit about common myths and realities. I'm only going to talk about a couple of them because I think there's a lot of myths out there as it relates to this topic. And maybe you've heard this, but I'm also just going to throw a warning out there. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to talk to your neighbor, all right? Just fair warning, I'm just throwing it out there. In a minute, I'm going to actually have you say something to the person next to you, so just wanted to prepare you in advance for that. So that's going to happen in just a minute. We're just going to role play for just a minute in just a moment, okay? I got to give you introverts a minute to process that. So one of the myths that you hear is there's people who talk about suicide, they are just seeking attention. I used to work in a high school, and I can tell you that was a myth that I kind of bought into and believed a little bit. Some people, I thought to myself, they're just looking for attention. That's not really something they would ever do. They're just kind of talking about it. And the reality is that no matter how casually or jokingly said, suicide threats should never, ever be ignored. And they may indicate serious suicidal feelings. Someone who talks about suicide provides others with an opportunity to intervene before the suicidal behavior occurs. I think that's an important one. Another myth that we talk about is, maybe you've heard this, or maybe you've thought this, or maybe you believe this, right? That the only one who can really help someone who is suicidal is a mental health counselor, therapist, or one of those professionals. Those are the only folks. We got to get that guy Lou on the phone because he's the expert. He's the guy that can help. We got to call Pastor Rich because he's the expert on this spiritual situation. We got to get the expert Matt or someone else out here. And the reality is special training is not required. Special training is not required to safely raise the subject of suicide. Helping someone feel included and showing genuine, heartfelt support can also make a big difference. During a challenging time, sometimes that's what somebody needs, is for someone to notice them, right? You may have heard the story of the gentleman who, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but there's a gentleman who had jumped off of the Golden Gate Bridge and survived. I think there's been several thousand people who have jumped off that bridge for whatever reason. It tends to be a spot. And I think there's only been 17 that have ever survived, and he was one of them. And he said, you know what? Right before I attempted to take my life, somebody handed me their phone and asked me to take their picture. And he said, you know what? Nobody cares. Nobody notices me. Nobody cares about me. Something else that I find interesting about that guy's story, and I will get you his name, it'll come to me in a minute. What's true of all of the people who jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge and survived, they all have one thing in common, is that they all regretted it the second they jumped. Just something to think about. We use an acronym called SAVE at VA. Right back there in the corner of the room, in the far corner there, I put some material out there. I put some squish balls and some pens and some different information. And one of the things I put out there is a wallet card, and that wallet card has some information related to what I'm going to share right now. So I'm just going to just touch on these topics. When I do a full training, I'll spend more of like an hour on this, but I'm just going to kind of go through it because for our purposes tonight, it's not to, be death by PowerPoint. It's really just kind of give you some information and let you take it and process as well. So we use the acronym SAVE to identify how we want to sort of address somebody who has identified that they are having thoughts of, or that you have some concerns about that maybe having thoughts of taking their life. And the S stands for signs, right? I think what's important tonight is to understand that maybe there's some signs that we can remember or that we can kind of say, hey, My radar's up right now. This is a sign that Matt mentioned when he spoke. The A stands for asking the most important question, and I'll talk about that in a second. The V stands for validating their experience, and the E is to encourage or expedite treatment. I'm not going to linger here a long time, but I will tell you that here are some of the signs. I'm going to read some of them off for you. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, you probably already have a few of these already running through your head, and that's good. But I'm just going to kind of go through this list and let you guys kind of just process and just think about this. And maybe right now what you may want to do is just be thinking about people in your life, people who you know maybe to be struggling. Maybe there's somebody that will come to mind. Hopelessness, feeling like there's no way out of a situation. One of the things that's really challenging for people sometimes is if there's like a public shame, right? Something happens that's real public. Something is put out there that's really difficult for them to sort of confront publicly. So we talk about that. Hopelessness, feeling like there's no way out. Shame, anxiety, agitation, sleeplessness, or mood swings. I think one of the underrated sufferings in our world is people who can't sleep. I had our third child, my little guy Gavin, who's 9 now. I remember he's 4 years younger than his older sister. I remember thinking to myself, I didn't remember feeling this exhausted. I didn't remember feeling like everything's a struggle, and that was because of a lack of sleep. And some of us, and maybe even in this room, know that feeling, right? Everything's more difficult when you can't sleep. Feeling like there's no reason to live, rage or anger is one that we see sometimes as a precursor to attempting suicide. Engaging in risky activities without thinking. If I had $1 for every vet who told me that when they got home from combat experiences that they were going $1.80 down the parkway on their crotch rocket, I may be a somewhat wealthy man. Sometimes people who are dealing with trauma, who are dealing with PTSD, people who are just going through those difficult experiences of having gone through something hard in life, they engage in risky behavior and oftentimes don't really realize why they're doing that. Increased alcohol or drug use and withdrawing from family and friends. So those are some of the signs that we talk about. A is where I just want to pause for a minute, and I'm going to wrap up here in just a moment. A stands for ask the most important question. Lou, we were talking earlier. This is my role play. You mentioned you've been going through a hard time. You mentioned that you've had a hard time. You and your wife have been going through some struggles. I think you said that you had some hard times at work. Lou, I got to ask you, man, with everything that's been going on, have you been having any thoughts of taking your own life? Have you ever been thinking about suicide? I have to tell you guys, as a professional with that hat on, for some reason, it's not a hard conversation for me to have with folks. It just isn't, I'm being honest. It's not that hard for me to have that conversation. But when I was sitting in the parking lot over by the bay with somebody from this church about 8-10 years ago, and I asked that person that question, it was a lot more intense and it was a lot more difficult. So I will fully acknowledge right here, right now, that this is not an easy thing to confront with somebody. But what I can also tell you is this. Sometimes when people are asked that question, you have allowed the floodgates to open. And let me tell you, those floodgates need to be opened, all right? I've had many veterans that I work with and professionally who have thanked me and felt so relieved for being able to actually talk about it and having the safety to do that. So I would encourage you, we're going to take a minute right now. I know you don't want to do this. Nobody wants to do this. But I'm going to just ask you guys to just role play with 2 or 3 of you guys together. Just practice it one time. I know you don't want to. I know you hate me right now. But just take a minute. We'll take 45 seconds. If you don't know your neighbor, say hello to your neighbor. And just practice asking this question. It's a tough one, but just practice it. I would say that there's no wrong way to do that. But now after I had you practice it, I'm going to tell you about a wrong way to do that. All right? So if I could just bring you guys back up here. When we talk about this question, Lou already said it. We have to confront it head on. And there's some do's and some don'ts, and I guarantee you that many of you probably did the don'ts that I'm about to talk about, and that's okay. That's why we're here. We're learning. We're talking about this. We're thinking about this. Do ask the question if you've identified a warning sign or symptom, which obviously that's not what we're doing here. We're just kind of going through it. Don't ask the question as if you're looking for a no. What do I mean by that, right? Hey, you wait till the very end of the conversation, someone's walking away, you both need to leave, you both know that the conversation's hey, you're not thinking about doing anything crazy, are you? No, okay, good. It's like you're like looking for this first train out of Dodge. You just want to get out of there. You don't really want to actually ask it. You don't really want to get the answer that could be there. You're just kind of looking to get out of the room with that person, right? So you do want to ask in a way that flows. So you don't want to just kind of come out of nowhere, but it's always going to feel like it's a difficult question. It just is, guys. It's going to feel difficult. And you know what? 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to get somebody that says, no, I would never do that. That's not, no, I appreciate you asking, but no, that's not where my head's at. I don't want you to think that. But in that one time, that person and you are going to be very thankful that you asked. So do not ask in a way that is invoking a no, is what I mean to say, okay? And you do want to ask the question quite literally. You want to say, hey, buddy, I'm concerned about you. Are you thinking about taking your life? Are you having thoughts of suicide? You want to ask that question and confront it boldly and completely. Don't skirt around it. Say what you mean. Don't say, are you thinking about hurting yourself? Because let's be honest, people could be thinking about hurting themselves and not killing themselves, right? Somebody could want to punch a wall but not want to die. Somebody could want to kick a cone or knock this thing over but not actually kill themselves, right? So we want to ask them that question, and that is the most important question that you could ask. And then as we're just wrapping up the V, I remember I talked about save. So we talked about we want to know the signs and symptoms. We want to ask that very important question. And V is we want to validate their experience. We want to validate them. Hey, buddy, wow, heavy stuff you're dealing with, man. That sounds really, really difficult, right? You want to validate them. You don't want to come at them and be like, come on, man. She broke up with you? Who cares? That's not validating somebody. Even if you don't agree with what they're going through, even if you're kind of inside thinking to yourself, really not that big of a deal, to them it is a big deal. So you want to validate that, all right? And then the last thing we want to do is we want to encourage them to get some help. Maybe you're going to be that first line of help in that situation, but you want to encourage them to get some help. I put some resources on the table back there as it relates to the crisis line. A lot of what I brought is veterans crisis line related, but just so you know, the way that national crisis line works is it's the same number. If you're a veteran, you just push 1. So it's the same number back there, and they're actually getting ready to revamp that. You'll see next year. There's some stuff going on with that too. That's all I have for tonight, really. I don't want to cover a ton of stuff here tonight. That's not my goal. Really, to kind of give you just a couple of key things to kind of latch onto. So maybe you're thinking about somebody else. Or I'm just going to say it. Maybe it's you. Maybe you're in a situation right here during this season of life to where you're actually going through something difficult. Don't leave here tonight without letting somebody know. I guarantee you there's someone here who cares. Pastor Rich cares, I care, Lou cares. There's a lot of people in here who care. If you're actually having thoughts of suicide, the last thing anyone in here would ever want to know would be that somebody left here and that they ended up taking their life, whether it be a week from now or a year from now or 10 years from now. That would be the most tragic outcome of all this. But what I can tell you is that there is help, and that there is hope for better tomorrows. So that's all I have. Lou and I were just talking briefly. I think we'll probably hold the questions, but maybe you have some questions, but we'll kind of hold those off until a little bit later. I will be hanging out by that table back there afterward for a few minutes. So anybody who wants to is welcome to come grab some stuff. I brought some stuff, so don't make me take it all home with me. And that's all I have for this evening. But thank you so much. We've got some other wonderful speakers who are going to be sharing about this topic, and I think it's really important. And I'm really, really proud of our church for coming out tonight, so thank you.
Thanks, Matt. I have a question, and I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you are uncomfortable right now? I see a show of a finger. I am, because this is not something we normally talk about. It's not something we talk about in polite scenarios, is it? But it's something that has affected every person sitting here in one form or another. And while we grieve people that we've lost to suicide, we have a positive perspective to work from. And I want to talk about Peggy Mallon. I'm going to take a little bit of Mike Parmenter's fire. Peggy Mallon is probably one of the strongest women I've ever met in my life. Some of you may know her, some of you may not. Her husband, Albert, was a New Jersey State Police detective who was killed in the line of duty back in the mid-'80s. Peggy struggled with 2 children, created a lot of help groups for widows of fallen troopers, is very involved in Survivors of the Triangle. She's a very, very strong woman. A few years ago, her son, Albie, walked out in front of a train down the block from my church. He was an Atlantic City firefighter. What she did with that is pushed Atlantic City to do suicide prevention symposiums for every single firefighter. Although we grieve and although we hurt, a positive can come out of the life that was lost. And I really, really want to stress that. And I think that tonight is the beginning of that positivity. If one person leaves here tonight with the idea in their mind that they can help someone avoid killing themselves, we've changed. We've changed the dynamic. We've taken life as the gift that it is from God and grabbed onto it and held it tightly. But we have to listen. And it is a very difficult skill to listen. I sat with somebody this morning and I didn't intend to. Today was supposed to be my easy day. But somebody called me. He's despondent over the loss of a girlfriend that he was very much in love with. And he's been cycling for the last couple of weeks. Today he called me. And I spent 2 hours listening to him repeat himself over and over and over again. And when I leave here, I'll call him up and see how he's doing. When I was despondent, it was financial, it was romantic, it had a lot to do with my health. It had to do with what have I got to live for? What's the point? If somebody would have listened, I would have changed. Thank God, God took care of it. But somebody's got to listen. I want to introduce Mike Parmenter. He's a retired lieutenant from the New Jersey State Police. I'm privileged to call him a friend. I'm going to let you give all your credentials, Mike, because I get tired talking.
My name's Mike Parmenter. I'm a Atlantic County resident, pretty much lifelong, live in Mays Landing now. And I joined the state police in 1982. I spent 26 years, and I'll go through a little bit of my time because I think it's relative. I was a road trooper in Absecon Station. Now, what we now know about Absecon Station, it's Lou's Church by the Bay. So the station that I served in is now Lou's Church, which is pretty interesting, and it's pretty amazing. And it's going to bring us some great things in the future, I know that. I worked there, I worked in Bridgeton, and I enjoyed being a road trooper. I spent about 3.5 years in uniform doing that kind of stuff, and then I became a detective. I was the detective for 11 years on an auto theft unit, and I worked all over the state doing auto theft cases and working with, departments of every shape and size, which was a great experience to learn more about the state police because We have our issues, right, like any department, but I learned that there's great police officers and great detectives and great organizations outside of the state police, which isn't what they taught us in the academy. We were the best. That's what they told us. But anyway, I did that for 11 years. The next 8 years of my career, I was a detective in our major crime unit, which you would liken to like a homicide unit. We investigated suicides, police shootings, homicides, kidnapping, and missing persons who were presumed dead, and then any other special investigation that the superintendent, chose for us to do. Towards the end of my career, an opportunity opened up where we were going to, it was after 9/11, we had received a grant. And through that grant, we were going to put troopers in our employee assistance program to develop a peer program so that troopers could help troopers. So now I'll go back, employee assistance program, what's that? Our employee assistance program is an internal program. Employees of the state police that are civilians look out for the needs of our people, our troopers and our civilians and their families. It's a pretty good benefit if you have a great employee assistance program, but we can look out for them in, with whatever difficulties they're having. It could be a workplace issue, a domestic violence issue, an addiction issue. But I got to work within that program for 4 years, the last 4 years of my career. It was a great experience, and I'm one of those fortunate people that I was always in a job that I loved, and I always loved the next one more than the one before. And I mean, it was a pretty big honor to be a major crime unit detective in the state police. That was a pretty impressive position to leave. And in this peer program, I just loved working with people. It was a great opportunity. I have to say, like when we're talking about suicide, I've been on like most ends of it. I investigated suicides. I've responded to homes of people who where someone just took their life and talked to family members. I've done counseling after the fact. I've done a lot of things around it, and I've been touched by it in my own personal life. I'll go on to explain. So I retired in 2008. I didn't work for 4 years. My kids were very young when I retired. They were 2, 4, and 7, and I had an older child as well. So I was a stay-at-home dad and took care of my kids for a while, which was a great experience. But it also kind of put me in touch with schools. I volunteered in my church. I volunteered in the schools, and I felt like I got a lot more well-rounded and around the kids. Hurricane Sandy then hit, and I was asked to return to the workforce, not in the state police, but with the Department of Department of Human Services. They had a program in the Mental Health and Addiction Services Disaster and Terrorism branch where they needed somebody, a first responder, somebody like me, to go out and talk to police officers and firefighters and EMTs after Hurricane Sandy, to talk to them about some of the struggles that they were having. So I visited communities up and down the coast, and it was a good job. And then it went from first responders to going to community meetings, and it was called disaster behavioral health, and I got involved in that. At the same time, I was getting restless, and my dream was really to go back to the state police and work for them as a civilian. That job wasn't happening quick enough, but I started working in addictions, and I worked in a first responder drug and alcohol treatment facility in Pennsylvania for 3 years, and I ran meetings and worked with a lot of cops, firemen, EMTs, combat vets that were all suffering from addiction. And I can say during that time, we lost a few people to suicide, and it was really difficult. And over the years, we continued to lose several more who lost their sobriety and their will to live. Fast forward to, 2006, I finally was hired by the New Jersey State Police to come back, recycled, as an employee assistance professional. I went through the training that I needed. I had been doing it for years, and I started working with the state police. And that's what I do today. I work for the state police as a civilian. I cover the Troop A area, which is the southern area of the state, and I help our troopers, their families, our civilians with things that happen in the workplace. they're not all fun. And usually when people are calling me, it's not their best day. It's usually something's happened in their career, with their family, something's going wrong. So that's what I live in every day. But I will tell you this, just like all my other jobs, the job I have today is the job I love the most. And even though sometimes the things in the job are difficult, it's extremely rewarding, and I love to go to work every day. So I'm going to reflect back a second. Lou talked about Al Mallon. Al Mallon, 1985, I was a young trooper. I had 3 years on the road. Word came that Al Mallon was killed. Well, I knew him because I worked at Absecon Station, Lou's church, and he would come in all the time. He was loud. Like when he was in the building, you knew he was there. He was loud. He was funny. He would show you like, hey, we just did a drug deal and this is what we got. He'd open a suitcase and, as a young trooper, you're like, wow, this is really cool. So when he passed, it affected me. And when the superintendent of the state police came down to talk to Peggy Mallon, I, being a junior guy, had the, I guess, misfortune, but really not, of having to pick him up from the helicopter and drive him to the Mallon house and then stay there with him while they had conversations about benefits and funerals and all the different things. Well, I became friends with Peggy at that point, and to this day, we're friends. Lou talked about Albie, the son. I knew Albie. I knew all the Mallon kids. I'm not going to say I grew up with them. I'm a little older than them, but I knew them, and I knew Albie. And when Albie died, when Albie took his life that day, another trooper called me and said, hey, Mike, they think that Al Mallon's kid just jumped in front of a train. And with my experience with the family and knowledge of the family, we worked with the Atlantic City Fire Department to make death notifications and, do all the things that were necessary, which was, it's a difficult situation knowing that, hey, Albie lost his dad in 1985, and now, he's gone too. And it was just a horrible situation. And Lou talked about, as the fallout of that was that, or I guess the positive result of that is that through the Disaster and Terrorism Branch, who I also do some teaching with, I was able to go out to the fire department, to the Atlantic City Fire Department, and we did 12 sessions of question, persuade, and refer suicide prevention training. And it was a really good experience. And I mean, it was a good experience because we did one class, 2 classes in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, and we had a great lunch in between. And Albie's stepsister taught a little bit about health and wellness. She's a yoga instructor, and I did the suicide prevention thing. And, Albie wasn't the first. He wasn't the second, third, fourth, fifth. He might have been like the 7th Atlantic City fireman that took his life. Going back, I'm going to jump around because Lou mentioned some things, and I'm going to pick up on them, but I'm going to talk about some other things. During my time as an EAP, within the first couple of years, we had back-to-back trooper suicides. We had a suicide of a trooper who was going through some difficult times, had been going through some difficult times, and finally took his life on the lawn in front of his home. That was kind of hard. Responded to his house in the middle of the night, and all of a sudden the family just kind of blamed us for everything that happened. And having some experience with it, we were able to talk and make peace out of that. But it was a difficult time. And not long after that, we had a second trooper who took his life. And I guess our suicidal antennas went up after the second trooper, right? And then everybody became like, wow, we can't let this happen again. We started another peer program because the one that I had kind of dissolved after I retired. And we became more aware of law enforcement suicide. I will tell you that in 1982, when I started, there was a sergeant at one of the stations, Woodstown Station, who went into a room, and I'm sorry if I sound graphic, but it's real. He went into a room in the station, put a trash can over his head, and shot himself in the head and killed himself. I don't ever remember there being anything about a funeral. I don't remember any talk about it in the stations other than, this guy took his life. And that was, that was about all that was spoken of it. It was quiet. Well, I can tell you today in the New Jersey State Police, we are talking about it. While it might be an uncomfortable conversation, we're listening and we're looking at clues. And the reality of that is sometimes people will say things like, well, if I don't get this promotion, I might as well shoot myself in the head, right? Yeah. If this doesn't happen, I might as well kill myself. I might as well jump off a bridge. And now what we're finding is guys that say those things, our troopers are wary enough to at least get them help, to say, okay, you're going to get screened. You're going to go to crisis screening. It's a good thing and a bad thing, but the better thing is, like Lou said, ask that question immediately, and you're going to probably, find out that somebody is expressing maybe some frustration in their career rather than a true suicidal intent. But we're learning, right? We're learning and we're observing, and I can tell you that the last 2 troopers that passed away, it wasn't like the one in 1982. It was a situation where we honored that trooper's lives. We had troopers there in uniform. We did everything respectfully and kindly for the benefit of their family and our organization to let people know that, hey, we're paying attention, we care, we want to help, and we're helping in the future. On a personal level, might sound like it's an addiction story, but it's a suicide story. I have a nephew, and I'm going to get choked up. I do it every time, but I have a nephew who's 26 years old. Bright kid, energetic, beautiful, intelligent. He had a Lehigh, he was a graduate of Lehigh University and had a degree in engineering. This kid was talented, he was bright, he could light up a room, but all his life he suffered with depression. One of the things that he found that helped with his depression was smoking pot, and then it was something else, and then it was something else, and something else, which eventually led to a heroin addiction. When you're the cop in the family, it really doesn't matter what you do or what you know. Whenever there's a problem, if there's a snake in the closet, and you can verify this for me, right? Snake in the closet, someone gets arrested, a ticket, whatever, a problem in the family, they call you, and I'm the one that gets called. And my sister eventually, told me, we're worried about Joe. We haven't heard from him. We went to his apartment in Philly, and the door had been kicked in, and it's really weird what's going on. So I went over there, and I was able to talk to him, and I got him into drug and alcohol treatment. And the next step was from drug and alcohol treatment was living in a halfway type of a home, a home with other addicts where they had rules, they had to have jobs, they had to be in a certain time, they had to go to meetings, and he said, that's not for me, I don't want to do that. He wanted to do his own thing because he was really smart. And this kid, I'm telling you, he could land a job in an engineering firm, work 6 months, do a great job, they think the world of him, and then start, banging out days like, knock off Friday, get high over the weekend, come back to work Tuesday, and then, or not show up the next week at all. And he would get jobs and lose jobs and get jobs and lose jobs, and we'd wonder, is he doing okay? Is he not? But he wasn't. So we sent him to another treatment facility. This time he didn't want to go back to where he was before. He wanted to find his own way. And he found his own way, and he went to a drug and alcohol treatment program in California that was advertised with like swimming pools and palm trees and all the amenities of home. And Joey went out there, and he was so smart, it hurt himself, but he met some people, and they basically started talking and decided, well, hey, you know what, we don't need to be here. We're going to get out of here. So 6 of them left at one time, treatment. Like a ringleader, they all left. He took them all with him, and he went from snorting heroin to shooting heroin because he was say, Uncle Mike, I'm not like them. I'm only snorting it. I'm not shooting it in my arm. They're different from me. But addiction is addiction is addiction, and he didn't get that. But he obviously was smart enough to know that. So when he came back, he eventually came back, and we tried to get him clean, and we had him in a day reporting program, and he couldn't live at home anymore because he was stealing his parents' stuff. And when I say my sister and her husband were great providers, they could have put him in any treatment facility. They offered to do anything, but he just wore it out, wore it out, wore it out. So, and eventually he found himself in the Clover Hotel on Route 73 in Maple Shade. That's where he was living. I don't know if anybody know the Clover Hotel? You're shaking your head, yes. Well, so it's kind of a dive to say that. But he was there. A van would come pick him up and take him into treatment every day. And we talked every day. He would check in with me, and in the times where we couldn't get him, it was really scary because that's the times where he would go to a pawn shop, pawn his phone, buy drugs, and then somehow get money back again and get his phone back. So this was a pattern. And on the night of January 10th, 2017, we talked on the phone, and he was arguing with me a little bit about his treatment and money, and that his father should be given more money, and like all of this nonsense. And we left, you would think on a bad note, but we left, and he says, "I love you, Uncle Mike," and I said I loved him. The next day I'm at a training, and we're doing a mental health training, and nobody's heard from him. The van that was supposed to pick them up said he didn't come out. We're calling different places, and we're calling each other. Who's talked to him? Who's connecting with him? Nobody found them. Eventually, we called the hotel. The hotel sent somebody to check the room, and he was slumped over dead from a heroin overdose. His problem was severe depression, right? Severe untreated depression and addiction. But he intentionally took his life and wrote notes to his family. He wrote notes to his family about taking his life and why he was doing it. So I mentioned the Clover Hotel. Well, as a young auto unit detective, I had been to the Clover Hotel with a detective from Maple Shade PD. We recovered a stolen car and a runaway girl with some creepy guy, and probably saved her from a lot of agony. That detective was now the chief of police at this police department some 20-some years later, and I called over there. We knew each other. We've connected throughout the years, and I was able to go to the police department and collect the notes and bring them back to the family that very night. And we sat on a bed together, my sister, her husband, my niece and her husband, and we read the notes. And one of the things that we saw was like an intense love for his family, sadness for the pain that he was putting them through, and he didn't want his nephew to turn out like him and have that sadness. And the chatter that started to rise, well, if we did this, or if we did that, if we did this, if we did that, what if when he was in, we noticed his depression in grade school and we didn't do this? But the reality is, you can always come up with another question when something goes wrong, right? I mean, we start brainstorming, well, and trying to hold ourselves responsible for things that are way beyond our control. What if we did put him in treatment? What if we took him to a different place? What if we let him come home? But the thing is, every time you answer a question, another question is going to come up to take the place of it, and you're just going to belabor your grieving process. Lou mentioned this early on. We want to hold ourselves accountable for somebody else's actions that we don't have the ability to stop or prevent sometimes. Sometimes we can, hopefully many times we can, but there are certain circumstances where things are inevitable and they're going to happen. And on the grieving side of that, holding ourselves responsible is something that maybe we shouldn't do. I'm going to jump around again to another time. In 2018, after Hurricanes Maria and Irma, I was deployed to the Virgin Islands. We sent 30 troopers, about 30 EMS people, and we kind of took over EMS operations and just tried to help the people in the Virgin Islands. One of the places that we went to St. John, which was really cool. I enjoyed it there. We lived in tents. It was a great experience because we were supposed to go for 2 weeks. They knew how to get us there. They couldn't figure out how to get us home. So we wound up having to stay an extra week. But for me, it was like one of the most rewarding times of my careers, and I'll say careers. While I was there, we have a trooper who makes license plates. Now, I know you say, making license plates, that's what you do when you go to jail. But this guy makes vanity plates. So when you retire, my badge number is 3733. He can put a license plate together with the state police logo and your badge number. And it's a really cool thing to hang in your office, right? So one of the guys says, yeah, we should get Ricky to make some license plates for us, for the Virgin Islands. So I took a picture of a license plate, and I thought, that's a great idea. And then when I'm back in the room, I'm going through my phone looking at the pictures I took for the day. And I looked at the license plate, and you can't see it real well, but it's JAI 267, right? Mine, and it's the only license plate that I took. I only took a picture of one license plate of all the things that we did. And I looked at it, I said, oh my God. My nephew is Joseph Anthony Inarado. That's the JAI. The 267, I said, well, he was 26 years old when he died. What does the 7 mean? So I called my brother-in-law, and I said, Joe, crazy thing that happened. I took a picture of one license plate, and it's Joey's initials and his age. He says, no, Mike, it means more than that. He says, I'll call you back in an hour. And he said, so my brother-in-law's a numbers guy. He's been working at a car dealership. He's my age. He's been working at a car dealership since he's 16. Numbers are his thing. My nephew was an engineer, right? So numbers are his thing as well. And they used to play numbers games with each other. And if you look at 267, 2 plus 6 equals 8. And minus the 7 is 1. If you take 7 plus 6, it's 13. Minus the 2 is 11. And Joey died on January 11th. And that's where the 267 comes from. Now, let me tell you something. That's not chance, right? That's a message from God that my nephew, Joey, he found his peace, right? He found his peace, and that's a message to me. I'm sorry, I don't mean to get upset, but I was a mess that night. I've gone on to teach classes. Sometimes I share that, and sometimes I don't because I get emotional. But there's a training out there. It's called QPR, Question, Persuade, and Refer. That's the training that I did for the fire department. I've done it for all the Atlantic County Police and Services in 2020. So most of our police officers in Atlantic County are trained in it, and I've done it for other groups, and it's a training that's available to you. There was talk about the Golden Gate Bridge survivor. That guy's name is Kevin Hines, and I show that video of Kevin Hines in my training because one of the things that Kevin, there was a whole series of events that took place before he got to the Golden Gate Bridge. It started with him writing out a note and leaving it home, and then he sat in his father's room and woke up his dad early in the morning and said, Dad, I just want to tell you that I love you. And his dad said, well, Kevin, it's early in the morning. I don't have to be to work till later. I love you too. Now, let me sleep. And then he went to school. He liked he liked one of the teachers at school. He went to her class for the last time. And then he withdrew from college. He got on a bus. He said he was crying his eyes out on the bus, snot running out his nose. People were pointing at him and like, what's up with this guy? Everybody got off the bus at the Golden Gate Bridge. That was the last stop. And he stayed on there. The bus driver said, hey, kid, time to go. Get off the bus. And he's a mess. And he walks off the bus. And then he said he walked across the Golden Gate Bridge several times. He said he passed tourists, joggers, walkers, police officers that were looking for suicidal people, and nobody asked him what was wrong. And what he said was, if somebody asked me, I would have told them everything. To me, I mean, he didn't need a personal connection. He didn't need, an expert. He just needed somebody. And we can be that somebody, because all we have to do is offer some form of hope to stop that impulsive act. You talked about the impulsiveness of suicide, where somebody can, within 5 minutes make up their mind that they're going to take their life and complete it in that short period of time, or a longer period of time. Maybe it's 45 minutes. Maybe it's a day. Maybe you see them falling off. We need to notice those things. And how often do we walk past somebody and say, hey, how you doing? And they say, fine. And you know what? We know that they're not fine. We're seeing all the things where they're not right. We know what their baseline is. And I think a lot of suicide prevention is recognizing people's baselines, knowing when they're off, and asking them some questions. And if you can't get right out to that suicide question, you can't say, are you thinking of taking your life? Are you thinking about suicide? Maybe ask them about their family, their job, their children, things that you have in common, something to create a dialogue and work yourself up and get the courage to have that. We really need to notice baselines. I tell our troopers, you're a supervisor, you should know the people that work underneath you. You should know when they're off and recognize that and ask questions. I think that's really important. It's important for parents, for teachers, for people who are in that position where they're seeing people on a regular basis. And some of the stuff in the QPR program teaches that. That's something, if there's an interest, if we can get together. Do you teach QPR or a form of it? Yeah. I mean, that's something that we could probably do for you if there's an interest here. It's a good program, but it basically strengthens you to be able to ask that question, to recognize signs and symptoms. Albie Mallon, we'll go back to Albie real quick. One of the signs for Albie was that when he left the station for the last time, he left his watch there. And one of the guys called him and said, hey, Albie, you left your watch. Don't worry about it. You can have it. I don't need it. Right? If you were to look into Albie's phone after his suicide, he broke off verbal contact with people maybe 12 hours before he took his life. He was concerned about some health care issues, and he was looking those things up on his phone. He looked up the train station, the train schedule for the rail line. It was a familiar place for him because he had a part-time job working at a business that backed up to the track. So he was in a familiar place, and he sat there and waited for the train and jumped out in front of it. Sad. It's sad. And then going home and talking to his ex-wife and children, talking to his family. Peggy, she was away visiting her son Michael, who is he's a psychologist for the VA, but they were out west. They weren't home to go and to tell them. So to try to figure out a way to let them know, because Peggy knows all about death notifications. She knew how they're supposed to be delivered. How do you do that when you don't know anybody that are there, right? But we were able to do that. We were able to visit his uncles, his sister. It was a difficult situation. But some good came out of it. We recognized other firefighter deaths, our own line of duty deaths, and the funeral for Albie was amazing. The firefighters honored his life, not how he died, but honored his life. I'm rambling between things, but I think the message is that suicide shouldn't be a topic that we can't talk about. We have to recognize it. We have to recognize things about, people's behaviors, what they say. And if we're concerned, ask questions. We don't have to go right to the suicide questions if we just think maybe someone's a little bit sad or a little bit off. But if we're seeing a lot of patterns, we need to go there and not let them get out of our sight. So what do we do when someone's suicidal? He mentioned a number, right? A telephone number. There's a suicide hotline, a national one. There's a state suicide hotline. There's another suicide resource for children where they can actually, text, because that's what kids are familiar with now, right? They don't talk, they text. Um, what I've done, it's called the Second Floor Youth Helpline. And I came here prepared to talk for a little bit. Lou said, just can you come on down and just talk about QPR? But in the absence of another speaker, I feel like maybe there's a little bit more information I can give you. The Second Floor Youth Helpline. I still have kids in high school. I've shared that information with my kids as soon as I got it. And I told my kids, if you ever talk to somebody or see somebody on social media that's despondent, let them know that this service exists. Put it out there once in a while, but tell an adult, right? Kids want to keep things secret, tell an adult. And if you're an adult and you're hearing that information, call the parents. Don't be afraid. Some people might get annoyed with you, but you know what? We can deal with people being annoyed with us, but because we're pointing maybe something about their child, but it's better than going to their funeral. There's resources out there for all of us. If you have somebody that's truly in a suicidal crisis, know that you can take them to the Atlantic City Medical Center. There's the psychiatric intervention program. They are prepared to screen and deal with people that are suicidal. And there's a crisis screening center in every county. Some people say, well, you know what, maybe you work at Atlantic City Medical Center and you're embarrassed to go there. Then go to the one in Bridgeton, or go to one in Ocean County or Burlington County. You can go anywhere. You're not locked into that, but get help. Always get the next level of care. If the next level of care is turning them over to the pastor of the church or the school guidance counselor or somebody that's going to ensure that they follow through with taking care of somebody. We don't leave people alone who are suicidal. We certainly don't leave police officers alone who are suicidal, who have the access, to a very deadly means, at their side at any time. So, I don't know. I'm not sure if you guys are interested in QPR. It's a pretty cool course. It takes maybe an hour and a half. It's informational. You get a little booklet. You get resources. It might be something that you find beneficial. And if we save one life, isn't that pretty amazing, right? Save one life makes it all worthwhile. Before I jump down and let Lou take over, any questions about that or anything that I spoke about? And I'm not an expert either. There's things, if you throw stats at me, I can't remember numbers or anything like that. But I do know that there's a large correlation between, drug and alcohol use and suicide. I can tell you that. 98% of police officers who take their life have alcohol in their system. Stuff to keep in mind. Anything, Lou?
I'm just going to say stay up here for a minute, Mike, and I'm going to ask Matt to come back up. But one of the things I'd like to touch on prior to is we all are survivors of traumatic events of one form or another. One of my joys and one of my pains was working Superstorm Sandy recovery as a construction director and spiritual advisor for the United Methodist Church. We had over 13,000 volunteers come through. 2 of them went home after a week of mission and committed suicide. One walked out into a cornfield. One, let's just say, it was a very ugly suicide. Traumatic events don't go away. They stay with you. Mike used the word hope. And I have to continually beat on that word. Jesse Jackson said it best: keep hope alive, keep hope alive. People that we lose through suicide, and I can give you the whole list, but then we'd be here till midnight. I've lost too many. But I try to get proactive. How do I get the next person who's in a traumatic downswing to recover? Part of it is sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is filled with stories of hope. Part of it is carrying their burden for a short time, and the experts will tell you that's probably not the best thing to do, But Mike, Matt, you both know, sometimes we got to carry it with them, even if it's for a short time. Sometimes it's referring it. But the most important thing is to be there. If we're not there, they're alone. And, I deal a lot with police officers. We've been teaching resiliency. Resiliency is that you catch somebody on the downward spiral before they hit bottom, because once you're at the bottom, you can't go up. It's too hard to do it. How do we catch people? This is, as terrible as it sounds, it's a grieving for all of us because we're sitting here talking about it. But it's also a possibility for all of us to make good happen by God's grace in the lives of the people that we care about, and perhaps in the lives of strangers. I want to open this up to questions because we've all been talking way too long. And I certainly hope that you have at least a couple of them. Yes, ma'am.
Trauma happens and trauma never leaves you. And you also said have people talk about it. But when they're talking about it, they're ruminating about it and ruminating. How do you help them through that to stop that cycle?
Either one of you want to take it? Can I grab one more mic?
Is there another mic? You guys got another mic up here? Those are the guys that can help with that. So the question that was asked is in regard to trauma. So you experience trauma. For example, I work with veterans. Maybe they were on duty one night joking and laughing with a guy 1 minute, and the next minute that person's no longer with us, right? That's trauma. You're driving down the road, a friend of mine driving down the road, and the car in front of him kicked up one of those reflectors. Next thing you know, it comes flying through his windshield and hit his passenger in the head. That's trauma. That stuff stays with you. It doesn't ever leave you. Trauma, when you talk about dealing with trauma, it is complex. It is dynamic in nature. There are different treatment modalities out there, professionally speaking. But I think as it relates to this topic, just getting somebody to open up and talk about their suicidality, that's an important first step. You're not going to be able to help them with their trauma probably that night. You're probably not going to be able to unpack that completely with them, and that may never leave them. But what you can offer is what I talk about, expediting treatment. There is hope and help as it relates to trauma. There's a lot of work that can be done as it relates to breath work, as it relates to exposure therapy, as it relates to EMDR. There's a lot of different modalities. Eye movement desensitization is a modality that a colleague of mine actually uses, where you kind of focus on something as you discuss something. And so there are a lot of modalities that can help deal with trauma. So I don't think that's probably a full answer to your question, but I think it's probably a good one. Maybe other people were thinking about that too. Hey, if I'm dealing with a guy who's been through this horrific experience, do I want to open the floodgates of that scenario to them? And you do need to be careful with that stuff, because you do have to be mindful of the fact that if you are dealing with trauma and you're opening up a window into that experience, that can be very powerful and very difficult. But most people who have experienced trauma will tell you they're dealing with it on their own daily anyway. So you're not reminding them of this horrific experience as if they haven't thought about it in years. More often than not, that's something that they are reliving often. So.
And for some people, they may have never talked about it with anybody. Just the fact that they're able to share it might relieve some of that burden. I'll give it like a little personal experience. When I was 16, a friend of mine was pretty much shot in front of me. And we never talked about it. All of us, we never talked about it. And I was watching a movie as an adult, and probably was only about 8 years ago. And in this same situation was unfolding in this movie, and I jumped off the couch and screamed because I never dealt with it. And luckily, I'm fortunate that my wife is a therapist and a social worker, and I could talk to her about it. But sometimes you bury these things, and you don't talk about them because they're unpleasant. and that the ability to kind of get them out and share it with somebody can be a little bit helpful. But yes, what he said, professional help. We're not expecting people to do professional things unless they have, the certifications to do so. But know that there are resources out there, and that's the R in QPR is, question, persuade, and refer to the people who can help.
Thank you for that question. Yep.
Okay, do you think it helps when you tell your children that if anything ever happened to you, that it would just devastate me, like as their mom? Like, would that help? Because I say that all the time. Like,
Yeah.
if anything, you got to realize if anything ever happened to you, you'd really be hurting me. And then I have like a second, going back about 4 years ago, my son did have something to where we thought that he was going to kill himself, and he was in college back then, and it only lasted 2 weeks, and we had to go and get him and bring him home. But it's something that we never brought up ever since. I mean, does it help to bring it up? Or like for me, I feel like it's in the past, and I don't know. I just wasn't sure if I should bring it up to him again. Did you ever have thoughts of that again? And like I said, I do bring it up saying that if anything ever happened to you guys, it would like devastate me. So I wasn't sure, like, should I bring it up again?
So, yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yes. I guess, so the question is, should we say to the person we love and care about, hey, listen, if you ever did this, if you ever decided to take your life, that would devastate me, that would devastate my family. I said throw the kitchen sink at these problems. Yes, absolutely you should say that. If that's what you feel in your heart and that's authentically how you feel, I can tell you right now, I've said that to 100 different people. Buddy, look, I know we don't know each other well, but I just want to let you know, man, if you ever took your life, that would be devastating for me. That would tear me apart to know that you and I talked about this and that you followed through on these things. Like, please do these things we talked about today. So yeah, I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable and definitely authentic, as evidenced by you sharing it with us today, that would be an appropriate response, an appropriate intervention, frankly, to intervene in that thought process, to let them know and to remind them anything you can do to shift them off the road they're traveling on. Not to say that person is, but is helpful and potentially very helpful. And as it relates to talking about it, yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it's definitely something that you guys, you said it. You had somebody take their life. You had someone die right in front of you, and there is that's called avoidance, right? Like, we want to avoid these painful things in life. A lot of times with trauma, avoidance kind of is part and parcel with trauma. We avoid triggers. Like one guy I work with, anytime he smells diesel fuel, it's a trigger for him. Well, sorry, bud. Sometimes you're going to smell diesel. It's going to happen. We got to be able to cope with it when it happens. So we could probably talk more about that, and maybe you guys have other things.
Well, I know that part of the thought process I have with a traumatic event is that should you bring it up, never in a negative context. Never when you're angry, never when you're irritated, but only to the point you survived that traumatic event, he survived that traumatic event, there's hope. And I think that's the one thing that, look, we've all gone through COVID for 2 years. I've seen people just destroyed from this horrible, horrible disease. It's a traumatic event. How do we get people through? Well, we get people through that, hey, you know what? There's a vaccine out there. There's this. And I'm not going into the anti-vaxxing thing at this point in time, but I'm just saying, there's precautions you can take. There are things you can do. put a positive, not a flowery, phony context, but a genuine one. That there's love there, there's care there, there's power there. And you make it work.
I was just going to add that if you do things from a point of love, it makes all the difference in the world, right? You know, I mean, your emotion, we see it, we feel it, right? If you do things from a point of love, you probably are better understood or more easily forgiven. So I think that's kind of important. You know, this is like for for an event like this that we're talking about suicide. I just encourage anybody who had something to say or something to share to do so and not leave holding on to something here, because that's the message that we're trying to get across, right? That we can have like good dialogue about this stuff. We can become more comfortable talking about it where maybe we weren't before, because it's that level of comfort that's going to allow us to approach a situation where somebody's suicidal and tell them, you know, we want you to live. We don't want you to die. You know, you point the message of hope. Hold on, pain ends, right? That's what we want to put out there. And when we're more comfortable saying it, when it comes out naturally, and you're not saying it like scared to death, or you're holding on to a question here and you say, well, I don't know if I want to answer that because I might be embarrassed. Well, let's not wait till you're in a situation where, you know, you really got to ask that question and you're paralyzed. So I would encourage you, if you have a question, hey, I can't answer everything. I don't know that if you can, and I don't know if you can, but collectively, if you have an experience to share or something, I just think the fact that we talk about these things makes the suicide conversation so much easier. You know.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So I work as an adjunct teacher at a local school, and one of the classes I'm currently teaching is for middle school girls on anxiety. And I found a lot of times, I can't remember specifics, but in classes since the beginning of school, a lot of times there's 4 girls I work with, and they'll say things like, I don't feel comfortable talking to the guidance counselor about this because they would be obligated to tell my parents. Or I don't feel comfortable talking to another teacher about this because they would be obligated to tell my parents. And these are things I don't feel comfortable telling my parents or talking to them about. So my question is, if cases like these come up in the future between now and the end of the semester, how should I respond to them? What should I be listening for that I really should tell their parents, even if it means breaking their trust? How should I handle it, and legally, what am I responsible to tell my superiors about?
Do you feel comfortable sharing maybe
Hang
just
on a second. Let me
in,
just
in the ballpark of what the,
let me just real quick. We're not lawyers, so the legal part with the school system is really tough. But I think this is one, Pastor, where maybe you're going to have a discussion on this later on, because you've just taken on the role of a pastor. And as a pastor, I refer when I can't handle it. And that's why the resources that both Matt and Mike have are hugely important, because you'll be able to refer those girls to somebody without jeopardizing either your career or their lives. And that's part of what this whole thing is about, is that we need to refer. We're not Jesus. We're not going to take care of everything, but we can sure find the right people to talk to. And there's plenty of resources. I mean, Mike, you could probably come up with at least a half a dozen just based on your years in the school systems.
I worked in a school setting for a while too, and I was going to say, I don't know what the ballpark of what the issue is that's coming up. Is it, could you say maybe just like what suicides come up? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I've definitely had situations where working with adolescents where I've said, you know, hey, you know, we have to report something. You and I, we gotta, before we leave today, we gotta deal with the situation. And I'm just wondering, do you want me to call, or do you want to call? Let's talk about what's going to happen. So, you know, kind of like including them in that. I've never called 911 on somebody who didn't know I was calling 911 on them. That's just how I operated when in my work as a therapist. I know therapists who kind of sneak around the back door and someone else calls, and next thing you know, the cops are shit. Like, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying, like, for me, I've always wanted to confront those things head on because, people, sometimes you can kind of help maintain that respect and that rapport because you were so honest with them at every stage instead of kind of going around, because you obviously care about these kids and you want the best for them, and you're trying to navigate it right now. So thank you for bringing that up. I will say this too, because this brings up a question that maybe some of you guys are thinking about. So I'll just kind of put a voice to it. What happens, right, when somebody's suicidal or someone says, "Hey, I have a plan. This is maybe it's already in motion," and you're sort of like that emergency response situation. I will say this, all right, because this is just true. Our systems are not perfect, okay? I think you mentioned PIP over in Atlantic City. PIP is probably not anywhere that any of us would choose to go. You may be in a room without a TV for 72 hours, right? You may, 7 hours in, be thinking to yourself, this really stinks. I don't want to be here, right? So I'm not pretending to say that these systems are perfect. But what I will say is that there is sometimes a time and a place where somebody needs safety. And sometimes safety is going to take the form of going to PIP, going to PIP. And that may not be, you may not be their favorite person after that's all said and done. But what you can look them in the eye and say to them is say, "Hey, I cared about you so much so that I was worried for your safety and for your survival. And I'm sorry that happened, but we can kind of walk through that." So yeah, Rich.
The hard part with adolescence is sometimes there is suicide is always to be taken seriously, right, when it's brought up. I think the difficulty that I found as a youth pastor for several years is sometimes there was language around that came up quite a bit with certain students, and that discernment to know when is it, like, again, you always take it seriously, but the person who cries wolf, when they cry wolf so many times, you always come to a point where you're like, what do we do, because they've said it so many times. So where's that discernment and those questions of saying, this is when I'm kind of really need to take that next step and tell my authority, or this is where I need to use discernment based on maybe some questions to know whether I need to go to that next level.
This is very complicated, tricky stuff, and professionals working in that field for 20 years are still asking these questions and dialoguing with their colleagues about how to handle things. What I can tell you is sometimes PIP and going to an emergency type of setting is a consequence for an action, right? I said these things. There was emergency response was initiated, and the consequence was that I ended up having to go through these screenings and go through these things that weren't much fun, right? So I don't ever look at PIP or these other emergency settings as a punishment, but there are consequences sometimes to words that are spoken. So there are going to be scenarios where, hey, yeah, you ended up in the spot because you said these things. So then we can kind of circle back to them, and it gives us a platform and a dialogue and an outcome and a situation to talk about and say, what happened? What was going on that day? What was happening before you said those words? Let's talk about that. So I think it does give you an opportunity to come back to those and to circle back. But like I said at the outset, this is not a perfect system in our country. And if anybody knows one in the world that's better, awesome. But that's what we're working with in this area right now. So, and I can tell you this too. I know some of the folks who work at PIP, and there's some really great people there. So it may not be great, and the outcomes may be difficult sometimes, but sometimes maybe safety is what's needed. So maybe that could be the launch point for them to get some other help that's actually going to be helping them and get some therapy or some assistance.
Okay.
Yeah.
In our school system, if a child mentions suicide in school, like they mentioned that they might take their life, they're going to go to crisis screening before they're allowed back in the school, which is a pretty serious consequence for, it's not a pleasant experience. And a lot of times, just because somebody goes to crisis screening, it doesn't mean that they get locked away for 3 days, 8 days, whatever. Sometimes they're screened by somebody who has some specific training in suicide screening, and they're determined that they can go home with a safety plan. Another thing too, and you mentioned it, but remember that suicide isn't the problem, right? Suicide is their solution to a problem that they feel that they can't solve themselves. So we need to go back and address the problem.
Thank you. I know you've been talking a lot about referring people for help, but do you have any thoughts or suggestions about someone who just continually refuses to go? Says, no, I don't need that. No, I don't want that. No, I don't think that'll help at all. Just somebody who you try to get them help, but they just won't go.
Like almost every single person I've ever worked with. So yeah, listen, I mean, you can forcibly send somebody to help, and it's been done before. The story you shared about your nephew. How many times did you say he went for treatment?
He went twice.
Yeah. They were able to get him to go twice. Some of us have seen the show Intervention, right? Chairs get thrown, people get attacked. I'm looking at Randy Smith. He could probably share about this topic too. I mean, there's only so much we can do, but one of the first things as far as it relates to that person can do some things to get some help. You don't have control of that. You have control of you. And, when you talk about QPR, question, persuade, refer, you can ask questions. You can persuade. You can refer. You can call 911 if it's an emergency. But you can't force somebody to get help that they don't want to get. And that's the hard thing, right? That's probably the hardest thing, because we all have loved ones in here who either have traveled down a difficult road and we wanted them to get help, or we saw the help that was right there, but they weren't agreeable to it. Hey, I've heard a lot of Pastor Rich's sermons that give me hope that, there can be a new outcome, and there can maybe be a change of heart, and maybe they could be that prodigal son. But, I appreciate the heart of your question, which is to say, hey, I see somebody who's struggling. I'm trying to get them some help, but they're refusing. And I would just say, don't give up on them. Don't give up on them.
Don't.
One of the things I would add there too, if you do call 911 and there is a law enforcement response, under the crisis screening law, if the person is a danger to themselves or others, in the opinion of the responding police officer, that police officer can take them into custody and transport them to psychiatric intervention treatment, or screening rather.
And the other reality is that we're sometimes afraid to call 911. When it's life or death, we can't be afraid. It's no different than any other life or death scenario. And to go back to you, because I see your heart is so much with the children, you've got support. And as Matt said, you may break their trust, but you'll save their life. And that's huge. But I think eventually more kids will trust you because of the action you've taken. Did you have your hand up?
Real quickly, like you said, out of a middle school, and I just wanted to share that, like, many years ago, my nephew tried, unsuccessfully, thank goodness, tried to commit suicide, and he was 10. He wrapped something around his throat, and, he suffered brain damage from it, but fortunately he's alive, so it's not too young. And the other thing that's just impressed on my heart is not to leave the Lord out of it, because, like Marcy, when you were talking about wisdom and what to know, what to do, many years ago, I've lived a tough life. Many years ago, one of my children came to me one night and said, I'm going to kill myself. And let me tell you something, the Lord is good. And I knew in my gut, we're going to Friends Hospital. That's it. Get in a car. There was no hesitation because God had us. So I just didn't, I want to give people encouragement that, the Bible says if any man lacks wisdom, he gives it. So ask.
It's a great point.
You want to keep the fat guy running, don't you?
I was just going to make a comment. It's a great point. We don't often think maybe that someone who's that young would possibly be able to have the ability or the understanding to take their life, but there are are scenarios out there of very young children taking their life. So
Okay.
Okay, I just wanted to point out it's not just young people that deal with this. I have a friend who started an organization called 22 Too Many because there are 22 suicides a day in the veterans, which she's trying to help with. And I just wanted to point out that the older folks that are home alone, maybe they've lost a spouse to COVID or something else, that they're quite vulnerable, so don't forget them.
Folks, I want to respect your time. This was supposed to go from 6 to 8. In 1 second, please. And I want to give Pastor Rich the opportunity to come up and pray and have people available here to pray with you. We've kind of kept it somewhat clinical, but we have to bring God back into it before we go home tonight. If you wanted to stay a little bit longer, that's fine, but the weather's not wonderful. I would much rather see us reconvene at a later date if it's okay with you, Pastor, and continue the conversation because it's not a one-night conversation. Sir?
can I just real quick, briefly before you answer, just to follow up on what you said? It's a great point, and it's not lost on me, and it shouldn't be lost on any of us, that our elderly population is some of the highest risk for suicide. So we want to be mindful of that. We want to be thinking about loneliness is a risk factor for suicide. And as we think about the elderly in our country, what do we value in this country? We value youth. We value productivity. We value wealth. We value relationships. When all of those things are pulled away from someone in their life, and maybe they're not as useful or don't feel as helpful as they used to be, sometimes suicide becomes a way out and something that people pursue. So thank you for bringing that up.
Sir?
Mom passed. A year and a half later, he said, I had enough. And a year and a half later, he just said, I'm done. So she hit the nail on the head. Like I said, my 88-year-old father-in-law took his life that way.
Sorry about that.
It's up to us to care for one another and to make sure that we listen. I think listening is the most important part. And I'm grateful that we had the opportunity tonight to listen to you, and hopefully this will continue. I don't think this is something that should stop with one session. Pastor, would you?
As we close, one of the things that I want to, just two things real quick. My hope is as Christians, we would grow in the art of asking questions. Asking questions. How many times have you been with even your best friend who goes on and goes on about their own world, but never asks you the question? And I'm not saying that we should feel guilty about sharing our hearts and our lives. That's not what my point is. My point is we can be with a best friend and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and then lose sight of, like, did I ask her a question? Did I ask him a question? Did I ask how their day was, how their week is, how their marriage, how their kids? And so often what I hear from us, and this is one of the things I shared when everything happened with the Schroeders, sometimes people don't need to be fixed. They just need you to ask questions and ask good questions. And sometimes good questions doesn't mean that you have to find the golden ticket question. It's just go a little further. Go a little further and just ask another question. And so even Julia, one of the things I would encourage you with is just with some of those kids, one, to say, hey, anything you're going to tell me, don't promise to keep it confidential. Like, hey, if you're going to hurt somebody or hurt somebody else, I can't keep that to myself. But what you can do is when they're talking about something, ask more questions. Why are you afraid about going to your parents about that? What are you afraid about your parents knowing about that? Because the deeper thing might be behind that is that I'm afraid my dad's going to beat me. I'm afraid that there's there's a deeper thing. Not that you need to be the professional. I'm not saying that you need to resolve all of it. But sometimes I think questions are a great way that we get to go further with somebody. And again, I'm not saying that you should figure it all out and deal with it all. I just think sometimes in this season of life, if you remember in nature shows, who does the lion take out? The lion always takes out the weak or the one who's separate from the herd. And the enemy that the Bible talks about, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. And so I would say two things. The questions is important, but the other part is community. God made us to be in community. So really, and this has been my message throughout this entire season, lean in and lean on. And that sounds so cliche, but the whispers, I believe, of the enemy is to isolate. They don't need me. I'm not wanted. Nobody cares. And so we just isolate. And so I just encourage you guys, lean in and then lean into the relationships of those who are backing away. And those relationships that are backing away, keep leaning in and keep being pursued. And as much as they're giving you the stiff arm of like, I don't want you, I don't need you, what they're saying out loud is they need you that much more to keep pursuing. And so I'm not a professional in this topic. All I'm saying is I do know people, and I know my own heart, and I know the reality of mankind. And what the answer is that we have that the world doesn't have is Jesus. And I believe that with all of my heart. What teenagers needed all 16 years of doing youth ministry was community, authentic relationships, and Jesus Christ. And I'm not saying that the professional help isn't necessarily, listen, that is. But we forget there's a spiritual battle. We forget that there is demonic warfare that whispers into the hearts and minds of people that gets us locked into something that feels like there's no hope. And the Jesus that I see and believe in the scriptures that came into this world 2,000 years ago, who gave his life on the cross, is the Bible says is the one who dwelt among us, who was God, who was incarnate, came in the flesh, set up tent in the neighborhood, so to speak, and lived in this broken, sin-filled world so that he would die for it. So he could give us a hope that goes beyond death, because Jesus rose again 3 days later. And all of the New Testament, a lot of the New Testament is the Apostle Paul and some of the other writers saying, keep persevering. I know it's hard, but there's glory waiting. Keep going. Don't give up. There's glory waiting because Christ is resurrected. The hope of the New Testament is that Jesus didn't die. He overcame death. He rose again. And so he says, yeah, listen, in this world, you're going to have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. And so we can endure, and there's tools that he's given us spiritually and physically to help us endure, longing for the glory that's awaiting us. Back then, and people around us, he calls us to endure the persecution and the hardships the world will bring. Okay, so Jesus, I really believe, is the hope that the world needs. It's why I do what I do, because he's changed my life and he's called me to something bigger. And the bigger thing that I realize is that people need hope, and not a temporary hope, not a quick fix, not a quick high. Those are temporary that doesn't fix anything. It leads actually to more damage. It's Jesus. So let's pray. God, we come before you. And we are constantly confronted with our humanity. Our humanity that ages, that struggles, that longs for things. And God, we live in a world that we see and are confronted with brokenness. We're confronted with death, decay. We are confronted with difficulties in this world that we struggle to make sense of. But God, I thank you that you are mindful of us, that you know us, that you formed us in your image and in our mother's womb, that we are not here by chance or by accident. And I thank you that, God, what the devil, what evil, what sin has separated and done damage in this world, we thank you that, Jesus, you came to restore, to redeem. And so, God, I pray for anybody in this room who has never come to the place of surrendering their life to Jesus. My hope is that they would know that they are loved by God, and that love was demonstrated through the greatest example and the greatest demonstration of love, which is sacrificial, and that you, God, gave your only son's life for us on the cross. You were beaten and you bled so that we don't have to. And so, God, I pray that we would see that hope is in Jesus, and that for us who have trusted in you, Jesus, as Lord and Savior, I pray that we would lean into people, that we would pursue and chase after, come alongside and encourage and pray and ask questions and point them to the hope and goodness of Christ. In Jesus' name, amen. We have some of our prayer team and some of our elders and staff that will be around. Please, if you need prayer or you have someone that you're concerned about that you would like us to pray with you and for that person, we are around to pray with you. There's coffee, there's snacks, there's drink out there. Please, you're welcome to hang out for a while. If there's something deep that you're getting ready to open up that door, but you're afraid to, but tonight you actually feel like you want to, please walk through that intuition, that thought that says, I've got something hidden, but it needs to be revealed. Please, if there's something that you are battling personally, allow us to at least talk with you and lead you in the right direction, okay?